Hello folks, Dick Fairburn here. We get back into talking about optics, particularly rifle optics. What we see nowadays is a lot different from even 10 or 15 years ago. Bigger scopes, more expensive scopes, completely different reticles, bullet drop compensator dials. The technology has advanced quite a lot, made long-range shooting much more effective and easier for people to learn. So today I'm going to talk about standard variable power optics for rifles. I talked about low power variable optics before. Now we're going to be in the standard range and tell you some of the variations, some of the things you need to know. If you're interested, stick around. We'll be back in a minute. When I started out in rifles, so we're talking late 70s, there were still a lot of fixed power rifle scopes out there. 4s, 6s, even 8s. For general purpose hunting, 4 and 6 were the most common. There were variables as well. 2 to 7s, 3 to 9s. And it looked as though the variables were going to start taking over the market. Now, even prior to my entry into rifle optics, I had been a photographer. And with 35mm cameras, we'll say, an example, if you wanted the sharpest, brightest lenses available for your 35mm single lens reflex camera, you went with a prime lens. Now, prime lens was a fixed focal length. A 50mm 1.8, we'll say, was the normal lens. The first step up on telephotos a lot of times was a 135mm, maybe a 2.8. They went up as high as 400mm or more back, but the variable optics for 35mm cameras, say a 70 to 210 zoom was probably the most common in the telephoto range. They weren't going to be as sharp, the lens openings weren't going to be as fast. Prime lens is what you really wanted if you wanted professional grade photography. Well, we now have zoom lenses for our 35mm and our digital SLR cameras that are better than the prime lenses were back then. And the same way with rifle scopes. The variable power scopes now are brighter. They're just better than even some of the fixed power scopes. And so fixed power scopes have become actually pretty unusual. There are still some out there. But the vast, vast majority of people putting rifle scopes on hunting rifles nowadays are getting some degree of a variable power optic. And these go from 2.5 to 8, 3 to 9 is very common, 4 to 12 is becoming more common. This scope, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it as we go along. I didn't really want this scope, but in the last 10 to 15 years, a lot of times when it comes to guns or ammo or reloading components, we have to get what we can get. Because while it may be listed in a catalog somewhere, it's actually pretty hard to find in the real world. This is a Leupold VX6. This is a 3 to 18 by 50. This is not what I wanted. It's bigger than I wanted, but it was all I could get. And I'll tell you some of the pros and cons of having an upper magnification at 18. We see guys in the hunting field now out there routinely carrying 5 by 25s, which were pretty unheard of not that many years ago. And I'm not sure they're a really good idea even today. So if you stop and think about it, I mentioned that I booked an elk hunt for 26. I'll be taking this rifle. This is a Tikka 338 Win Mag. I killed a moose with it in 2007. When I set this rifle up, I put a Leupold scope. Now, if you hear me talking about Leupold scopes, I am not supported by Leupold in any way. when I was a pretty active writer for 2 or 3 of the police magazines and over-the-counter gun magazines, all of the scope companies, even all the ammo companies and gun companies, everybody else, they took care of those print writers. And so I could get Burris, I could get Leupold, Redfield before they went out of business. I could get those accessories for my rifles as a writer on a writer discount. And it was not unusual to get 50% off of retail price. And I had toured most of the plants. I'd seen how they made them. I was pretty impressed with Leupold, and I saw Leupold being used more and more on police sniper rifles and more on military sniper rifles when the Army's M24 sniper system came out. It had a straight 10 power Leupold scope. So since I could buy them at a heck of a discount anyway, I pretty much standardized on Leupold. Now that discount is essentially gone. Now that everybody who has a YouTube channel considers themselves to be a gun writer, the numbers have gone from a couple of hundred in the whole country to thousands. And the companies simply just can't give those kind of discounts anymore. But I have stuck with Leupold because I've had such good luck with them. So I'm not shilling for them. I'm just happy with them. When I set this up, I put a VX3 Leupold 2.5 to 8 scope, considerably smaller, and it had the Boone & Crockett reticle. I'll talk about reticles as we go along. The Boone & Crockett reticle is what I call a holdover reticle. It has extra marks in the reticle to hold over to compensate for bullet dropout at longer ranges. I bought this rifle. I set it up specifically for a moose hunt in Wyoming in 2007. I ultimately killed a record book SCI moose. In fact, in the Outfitters Association, Wyoming Outfitters Association, it took #1 moose for the year. Biggest moose killed by a guided hunter. I shot it at 467 yards measured by laser rangefinders with that 8-power scope. And if you stop and think about it, you know, an 8-power scope is like cutting your distance by 1/8. So let's round it off to 480 yards. It was actually 467, but my simple math mind. If I'm shooting at 8 power, that's really essentially the same as looking at that moose with my bare eyeball at 60 yards. That's a lot of magnification. Now the aiming point I used on that reticle was not a full width bar for 300 or 400 yards. It was a tiny little tick mark meant for 450. I held it just a little bit high. But even at 467 yards, that was very obviously available to me at 8 power. Since then, I have decided to upgrade my scopes. Leupold brought out their VX6, which is their top-end commercial line of scopes. They have some Mark V's and things that are really kind of blending over from their military developments, and they're great scopes. But I think the VX6 is just a very top-end scope. In my opinion, it compares to a Swarovski or a Callies or a Schmidt-Bender or any of the European stuff. I think they're virtually as good. They're virtually as rugged, and they're generally considerably less money. So when the VX6 came out, I decided I wanted a 2 to 12. The 6 part of the VX6 is how much magnification it has. You're going to magnify your base magnification of 2 times 6, so it has a top magnification of 12. 8 was enough for a moose at 467 yards, so I think 12 is going to be enough for a deer, antelope, or sheep. Even further, and I did not set this rifle up to shoot that size of game. I set it up to shoot elk and moose type critters. So 12, in my opinion, is plenty of magnification. But I like the 2, because if I happen to use this on something dangerous someday, get a chance at a grizzly hunt, I want to dial it down for that really wide field of view down around 2. This scope does it all. But here's what I've bumped into. The hunt I'm going on in 26 is a horseback hunt. Pack in probably several hours horseback to get to the camp, and then we will hunt from that camp horseback every day. Now, I used to do that on my own. I had my own horses, I had my own pack outfit. My buddy and I did a couple of hunts like that over the years. I have my own saddle scabbard. It's commercially made leather. It's not used super high end, but even these are pretty expensive nowadays. Here's the problem I'm up against. That 2.5 by 8 scope went in there perfectly. This 2 to 12 won't. It's too big for the scabbard. That's the thing that we've seen change from Western hunting rifles of 20 years ago to today. The rifles aren't that much different. Now, certainly we see chassis rifles, but they would probably fit in here just as well. It's these big scopes. So my saddle scabbard does me no good now. So I will check before I go, and I'm sure the outfitter will probably have saddle scabbards available, and being more modern, they're going to be made to fit those bigger scopes. And they make softer cases now. They're not leather because, you know, leather stuff is crazy expensive nowadays. So they're going to be more soft-sided cases. So it's not that big a deal to upgrade my saddle scabbard. If you want a saddle scabbard of your own, you're setting up a hunt nowadays, you're going to buy one big enough for whatever your rig is. But this, I think it wiped down with a little bit of oil and put in storage, really won't fit any of my bolt action hunting rifles anymore. The 2 to 12 won't go in there. The 3 to 18 wouldn't even come close to going in there. That's why I didn't really want this 3 to 18. It was my intent to set both of these rifles up with identical scopes, 2 to 12, Leupold VX6, same illuminated reticle. And the reticle I chose is what they call their TMOA, Tactical Minute of Angle. It's crosshairs with duplex thick parts on the outside, and in the insides, top, bottom, left and right, you have hash marks, little hash marks for every minute of angle, essentially every inch at 100 yards. And they are illuminated. I can turn them on for red. Another very interesting thing with these is we see people putting levels on scopes nowadays to make sure you're dead level for long range shooting. These VX6s have an internal electronic level that you can turn on. And when you do that, when you go through the sequence to turn that feature on, if you're looking through the scope and you have to have your illumination on, even in the daytime. So even under bright circumstances, I'm going to need that red illuminated reticle turned on. If I am more than 1 degree off, left or right, then that red lighted reticle will flash. So I just bring it back to level. It stops flashing. I know I'm dead level. So that's the kind of level of technology that we're seeing come across in some of these scopes nowadays. I couldn't get 2 212s. And at the time, I had a buddy who worked at Leupold who ran their custom shop. And I said, okay, well, just get me another 2 to 12 and swap the reticles to illuminated TMOA and I'll have 2 alike. And he said, the way the internals work, I can't get you one. It may be years before we can get you one. Leupold was so overwhelmed with military contracts at the time that very little of their production was really available for civilian type scopes. So in order to upgrade this rifle, this originally had a 3.5 to 10 Vari X3, I had to go to a 6 to 18. Someday I may get that 2 to 12 and I will downgrade this scope because I don't think I need 18 power even on a deer, antelope, or sheep rifle. They're bigger, they're heavier, they're more expensive, they're more difficult to fit in a saddle scabbard. But that's the fad nowadays, is to go with lots of big glass and high magnifications. And I think it's almost counterproductive, but that's just me. I think anything up to the 10 range on the upper end of the scope, 10 to 12, is all you're ever going to need for hunting. For sniping, maybe more. How many of us are snipers? Some of us like to think we're snipers. I used to be a police sniper, but I sold my sniper rifle several years ago because I didn't do anything with it. It sat there year after year after year gathering dust. And if I really need that kind of precision from a rifle, this 280 will shoot every bit as well as that 308 and have more range besides. So that's what we're looking at in these scopes. Low power variable optics, generally 1 to 4, 1 to 6, 1 to 8, even 1 to 10. So we can get up into that 10 range with a small scope if I really want to. But it is nice to have that bigger objective and those more sophisticated reticles that come with the larger scopes. One thing you will find when you're out in the field, real hunting, depending on the kind of conditions you have, there is mirage. And when you elevate the magnification on your scope above a certain level, you'll start getting that kind of running water appearance of mirage. And mirage can happen not only on hot days when you're looking out over a desert kind of situation, but you can get mirage even if there's snow on the ground. It is the difference in temperature between the ground conditions and the air above it. And when there is a significant difference, you can get that kind of running water effect of looking through mirage. The higher you dial up the magnification of your scope, the more likely you are have mirage become a problem. So a lot of times with these 18 power scopes, 25 power scopes, a lot of times you can't shoot them at those high magnifications anyway because your image goes to hell. That's just another reason why I think you need quality glass, and you need it in the 10 to 12 range upper end. If you want more and you want to lug it around and you want to pay for it, that's great. But it may not pay off for you a lot of times, other than maybe impressing your buddies. Now, one thing you need to know about these scopes, and most of them are still fixed parallax. When you put a scope on a rifle, the objective ends, the ocular ends of scopes are threaded, and you can screw them in and out. What you are focusing when you do this, you are focusing your eye to the reticle image that's within the scope. You are not focusing the actual image that you're looking at, the trees, the grass, the elk, whatever that is. You're focusing your eye on the reticle. And the best way to do that a lot of times is once you get your scope set in the rings, you get your eye box adjustment made so you've got your field of view is full. A lot of times just go out against the open sky, a totally blank background, and thread this in and out until that reticle, just the reticle, gets absolutely razor sharp for your eye. And then if it has a lock ring, lock it down. Some do, some don't. Most of them that don't have a lock ring have a pretty snug system so that it's not going to get moved very easily. What you are not focusing is the image. Most fixed parallax scopes for hunting rifles are set at the factory, focused for about 150 to 200 yards. Now, on this scope, elevation, windage, parallax. This also has a button in here to turn on the illuminated reticle, and it holds the battery to do that. But I'll show you close-ups. On the side here, it's marked for distances. So I can actually focus for a given distance. Now I am, to at least to a degree, I am focusing the image that I see, the trees, the elk, whatever's out there. Some of the early scopes that had parallax adjustment, the ring was on the front, and they called them an AO, adjustable objective. And they were usually marked in hundreds of yards. So you could set them for 100 yards. You could set them for 400 or 500 or 600 yards if you're taking a long shot. The image does not necessarily go that much in and out of focus with those AOs. It is more pronounced when you look through one of these side parallax adjusters now. What parallax is, if your eye is absolutely dead center behind the optic, then those crosshairs will line up with bullet impact at wherever your zero distance is. If your eye gets a little bit out of that optical center, at 150 yards, if it's a fixed parallax, it doesn't matter. Where you can get your eye out of alignment, the crosshairs are not going to move. They're going to stay there. But if your eye gets out of alignment at, say, a 300-yard distance, you will actually see the crosshairs move a little bit on the target. That's called parallax. Everything is not dead centered in the optics of the scope. And as I said, if you're well centered, if you have a good natural body form and you're well behind the scope, probably not going to make any difference at all. But if we're really splitting hairs, especially at longer distances, that parallax can become a problem. So a lot of these higher end scopes, and especially those with more magnification, will have that parallax adjustment over here. I keep mine set, I zero this rifle at 200 yards, I keep it set at 200 yards. I don't think that's going to become a problem for most of the shooting I'm likely to do. But if I'm going to take a long shot at 400, 500, 600 yards, and I have the time to do it, I can adjust that to 600 yards and refine that parallax so that there's not a chance of making that little bit of out of center adjustment. This is the same scope, VX6, but it's a 2-12, so it's not necessarily intended for long range. It does not have the parallax adjustment, nor does it have the older front end style of the adjustable objective. So this is set, I believe, they set these to around 200 yards. So if I'm shooting 500 or 600 yards with this and I'm not optically perfect, I could get a little bit of variation in the reticle placement. But as I said, as they go up in magnification, nowadays you will almost always see that side focus to adjust your parallax with the newer scopes. Okay, American scopes traditionally had a main body, a main tube of 1 inch in diameter, 1 inch outside, which fit 1 inch rings. As we see scopes develop, I think a lot of this came from the Europeans. They built 1 inch scopes, but they're more metric oriented. We started seeing the scope tube diameters grow, first to 30 millimeter, then 34, there are some 38s out there now. The larger tube has some advantages. First of all, there's more surface area on the outside for the rings to clamp to. Holds them a little bit better. It allows larger internal lenses and larger internal mechanical components. Larger lenses are generally brighter, so you can shoot a little bit better into the to the dusk in the evening or first thing in the morning. Larger lenses are also heavier and they're also more expensive. So as we see these features grow, we see scopes now that are routinely more expensive than your rifle, sometimes double the price of your rifle. They have become pretty expensive. I'll show you a couple of illustrations of some of the internal things that go on. In any of these variable scopes, there's another tube that rides in the center. That contains several of the optical components, primarily that which allows the zooming of the magnification from 2 to 12 in this case. The reticle is inside of there. And so that inner tube can be adjusted up and down, left and right, and that is the windage and elevation adjustments that allow you to zero the rifle in. I'll show you a couple of illustrations about how that can cause you a problem if you're trying to shoot long range or you're trying to zero a rifle in, say, a scope that has come off of another rifle. A lot of the mounts, especially the early Redfield and Leupold mounts, a lot of them had an opposing base on the back. The front was a dovetail that dropped in, turned 90 degrees, and then on the back there were two opposing screws that allowed you to move the back end of that scope left or right. And I think a lot of that came from the early days when they were converting military rifles, so they were drilling and tapping holes, and they weren't necessarily lined up perfectly with the bore. So that gave you the ability to kind of center the back end of that mounting system better with the bore of the rifle. The problem was some of those got pretty far off center. And as the illustrations will show you, that inner tube is kind of like a pencil inside of this. It goes up and down for elevation adjustment, it goes left, right for windage. If it's not centered because the mounts are screwed up, then this dot in the middle might actually be over towards one side. So instead of having the full up and down range of motion, you may only have just a little bit of up and down motion. And where that showed up is when people were trying to zero rifles and they just couldn't get them zeroed. They were still adjusting, trying to bring a round up or down. They kept making changes to the knobs, but nothing was happening. And that's because that internal tube had physically bumped into the outer tube and could not physically move anymore. So the larger tubes, the 30s, 34s, 38s, they give you more adjustment, more up and down movement for people who want to shoot longer and longer ranges. And when we really first started to see this, when military snipers were trying to go out past 800 yards with the 308 or 7.62 by 51 round. 800 is really kind of the maximum effective range at that. I mean, certainly you can hit further, but they were running out of adjustment. They didn't have enough up adjustment to get it on out at those distances. So part of what they did was change the bases. They actually shifted the bases so that instead of zeroing in the center, you were zeroing in like maybe the bottom third of the adjustment range. They give you more up adjustment to counteract for the trajectory at very long range. And a lot of mounting systems now come with 20 MOA built-in adjustment to allow for that. Do you need that 20 MOA for hunting situations? I don't think so. And how many civilians are truly going to be out there in that long-range sniping kind of environment? If we end up in a civil war, we may see some of our civilians pressed into that role, but I don't think very many, and I don't think very often. Let's talk about reticles, what we use to aim with. They called them crosshairs originally because in some of the very earliest scopes, they were literally two crossed hairs. It's my understanding that some of them were even spider webs. As you imagine, those were not necessarily the most robust things that we could put in a rifle. And so if a rifle produced pretty good recoil, sometimes those would snap. And even to this day, when Illinois was, we've become a straight wall rifle case deer hunting state now. But we still see a lot of 12 gauge shotguns out there with scopes on them. And a couple of my friends have had, they come in and go, there's something wrong with my scope. And then you look in there and you've got a reticle side that's hanging. For the last probably 30 years or more, those reticles have been made from wire, metal wire. But having seen those things manufactured, that metal wire is not really high tensile strength steel wire. It's kind of soft. And sometimes high recoil on lesser brands of scopes can break that way. Most of what we see in reticles now, inside that little tube, inside the main tube that I told you about, most of the reticles we have nowadays since the advent of lasers are etched glass. It's a piece of flat optical glass that's been etched with a laser, and a lot of times then those etchings are filled in with different colors or silver metals, and they give you that black image against what you're viewing. That allows them to be more than just a crosshair. Now the duplex crosshairs were the fine crosshair center and had thicker edges at the top, bottom, and sides. The way they made those was to take that soft wire reticle and actually squish it in a machine to kind of, flatten it out and make it appear, well, didn't just appear wider, it was wider. It was also a little bit more fragile in some cases. And that's why you wanted a high-end scope. For example, the Burris, the Redfields back at the old original Redfields of the day, the Burris, the Leupolds. Those high-quality scopes, they get tested. They get put into a machine that simulates, like 375 H&H recoil several times a minute or several times a second almost. They just jars the hell out of those things to see if something inside is going to break, including that reticle. So etched glass reticles are generally never going to break. It also allows a more complex reticle to be made than just a crosshair or just a duplex. And so now we see what I call holdover reticles, which are reticles with additional aiming points below the main crosshairs. I said I had a 2.5 to 8 on that 338 Magnum. It had a basic duplex reticle with the thick on the outside, thin crosshairs in the middle, zeroed at 200 yards. Below that was a bar for 300-yard aiming point, a bar for a 400-yard aiming point, and those bars were even wider, so the ends of them was the equivalent of a 10-mile-per-hour full value wind from the left or right. Where the duplex point was at the bottom has always been an additional aiming point. That happened to correspond to 500 yards in the Boone and Crockett reticle, and it had a little tiny horizontal tick mark for 450. And as I said, when I shot my moose at 467 yards, I used that 450 tick mark a little bit high of where I wanted the bullet to impact. And I ended up firing 3 rounds of the moose. I hit it on the first round, and a lot of times you'll hear the impact of a bullet when you hunt out west, a rifle bullet. You'll hear a thwop when that bullet hits the chest. And depending on the sound, once you've heard a lot of them, you can even tell pretty much where you hit. If you got a good solid chest hit, if you got a gut hit, you'll hear a sharp tick if you broke a major bone. The wind was such that day that I could not hear the impact. You know, at 338, I lost the image and recoil a little bit. I got back down on, and I asked the guide, I said, I hit him, didn't I? And he goes, oh, you shook his whole body. He's looking through the binoculars. Moose took about one step. He's in this giant tangle of dead trees from the 88 fire that had burned. He took a step. His head now was blocked by some pine trees and the front of his chest. So I fired again, and the guide said, nope, you cut a limb off a pine tree. Hold a little bit farther away. So I did hold a little bit farther away. I also held a little bit higher, kind of thinking I wanted that high shoulder shot, because if this moose had gone 25 or 30 yards, he was going to be in a bottomless bog. We wanted him dead right where he was. So at the third shot, broke the trigger again, dumped the moose right where he stood. Well, when we got over there, we found out that the left antler palm had a mark in it, and it was actually a fragment of bullet from that second one that had hit a pine tree and blown the bullet apart. A fragment of it had hit the palm of the antler and splintered it out the back. So I can legitimately swear that I hit this moose 3 out of 3 at 467 yards with an 8-power scope and a holdover reticle. That system can work just fine. The newer rifles, and part of the reason I wanted to go with these VX6s was, instead of a holdover, Leupold and many other manufacturers now, they have, Leupold calls theirs a CDS, a custom dial system. It's an elevation adjustment knob. I pick a zero, either 100 yard for fairly short range cartridges, 200 yards for longer range cartridges. So the center of my duplex is going to be 0 to 200 yards. Then I send them the actual velocity chronographed from my load out of this rifle. They know the ballistic coefficient of the load. They know, I tell them atmospherics. So for example, this knob is made for this load. This is a 338 Win Mag load. It's a 225 grain AccuBond Nosler bullet, 2,800 feet per second. This particular knob is set for 8,500 feet above sea level, so this is as high as I'm ever going to hunt, probably in Wyoming. 40 degrees Fahrenheit. It's set for yards, not meters, and the adjustments are 1/4 minute of angle. So I send them all the data. They will laser cut this knob for me, and the newer ones have a locking thing, so it's set on 2, won't move. I push in the lock. If I've got a 450 yard shot, I simply dial it up to 4.5 and hold dead on. I got to worry about windage, and I can do that with windage as well, but most of the shooters I know, whether they be target shooters, snipers, or hunters, generally don't dial in the windage, because wind is not generally a straight line value. It varies. There'll be gusts, there'll be lulls, so they're dialing for distance, but they're holding for wind. And that's why I like these TMOA reticles. Every inch there's a little tick mark. And if I use the Marine formula, and I will put a link to it at the end here for another video that I was taught in NRA Police Firearms Instructor School, I can work this out in my head for the wind for this particular load and the distance of my target, and I'm going to get an answer for the wind in minutes of angle. And this particular load is going to have a wind factor of about 20. So if I'm shooting at 400 yards, that's 4 times 100 yards is 40. 40 divided by 20, the conversion factor of this is 2. So I mean, at 10 mile an hour full value wind, I need to hold 2 minutes of angle into the wind. If I got a wind coming from the right towards the left, I hold over 2 tick marks, and that should allow for enough windage. So I'm going to dial for distance. I'm going to hold for wind. And I really like these bullet drop compensators, and they are so, if you give them the right data, they are so accurate for distance that it is spooky. It's a science, it's not an art. Wind calculation, wind allowances is an art. But there are a lot of holdover reticles. I think the Boone and Crockett was probably the best balanced for a lot of different loads, because my particular load happens to hit those 300, 400, 500 marks exactly. And if it isn't, then you might adjust your zero a half inch one way or another, and you can run that out on the computer and get it figured out. But other loads, and you might zero it too, but instead of, if it's flatter shooting than that, say a 300 Remington Ultra Mag, then that 300 might correspond to 325. The 4 might be 450. So you just need to know those for your holdover reticles. With that dial system, you don't need to know that. You dial the distance and you're on. A lot of people are enamored of mil-dot reticles, and that came from the military. Some of the earliest holdover reticles had a dot, or really kind of a football-shaped image, up and down those verticals and across the horizontal wires. And the center from one dot to another was a mil. Now, in its simplest way of looking things, a mil is a ratio of 1 to 1,000. So that means at 1,000 yards, 1 mil to another would be the equivalent of 1 yard. At 1,000 feet, it would be 1 foot. 1,000 inches, it would be 1 inch. What that equates to in minutes of angle is approximately 3.6 minutes of angle per mil. So those dots are 3.6 minutes of angle apart. I did not grow up with the mil-dot scope. I did not use it in military sniping. So it's just a little bit alien to me. It works fine. If you like it, it works great. You can have a range table on the side of your rifle. 300 is 2.5 mils. I can do the same thing in minutes of angle. For holding wind, 3.6 minutes of angle of wind holdover is actually quite a bit. That's a pretty high wind or a pretty long distance. So I like the finer measurements of minutes of angle, which are 1.047, or we're going to call it an inch at 100 yards. Either system will work. There's another kind of holdover reticle out there on the market. If you've never seen these, I'll put some images up there. To my knowledge, the first company to bring them out was a company called Horus. And generically, they're called Christmas trees. You have your standard crosshairs, and then below the horizontal line, you have extra dots. And there may be 2 here, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and I'll put the image up there now. These dots kind of form a Christmas tree. Those are additional aiming points, and while those dots can be calculated in minutes of angle, generally they are mils, because of the people who are using those kind of scopes are trained and comfortable with the mil. Where they really shine is extreme long distance sniping. And the system as it was intended to work, generally you've got a shooter and a spotter. The spotter has a fairly high power spotting scope that they are ranging the target with. And with those mils, or any holdover scope, any known dimensions within a reticle, you can use those to estimate distance, and you can do it pretty carefully. And in fact, when the mil-dots first started to become pretty popular, a thing came out called Mil-Dot Master. I think probably most people don't use the book or anything anymore. There's apps on the phones, but it came with kind of a slide rule, and it's kind of cool. You can select a target size. Let's say a license plate. Now, let's say I've got a 12-inch license plate, 12 inches wide. I put my reticle on there at my say maximum magnification, or wherever I'm going to put that magnification. And let's say it is 8 mil dots from the left to the right edge. So it's 8 mils on a 12-inch known target. That tells me that I'm 500 yards away. So any of these holdover style reticles can be used to estimate distance very effectively. This Mil-Dot Master it's pretty cool. As I said, I believe there's some phone apps out there nowadays that are just as good. And you don't have to carry anything extra with you that you don't already have on hand. So in these VX6 scopes, at the time, you could get almost any reticle you wanted from the Loophole Custom Shop. You could get a TMOA, tactical minute of angle. You could also get a tactical T-mil, tactical mil. So the tick marks, instead of being a minute of angle, or roughly an inch apart at 100 yards, they were 3.6 inches apart. But to me, that's a lot coarser, and I like to do the finer work sometimes. The holdover style reticles, especially in the LPVOs, low power variable optics, a lot of those are kind of a horseshoe effect. And they will have a center crosshair and then kind of a round circle as a larger aiming point. And I'll talk about why here in a minute when we talk about first or second focal plane, where your reticle lies within the scope. Those horseshoe reticles a lot of times are set up for one specific load. And a lot of those for the 5.56 are set for the M855, the 62 green tip. So you zero at 100 or 200, whatever your scope specifies, and then there will be holdover points for out to rather extreme distances. Originally, the reticle was always in the second focal plane. And what that meant was the reticle was always going to be a consistent size for a variable power scope. If you zoomed from 1 to 4, 2 to 8, whatever you zoomed for, the reticle size stayed consistent. So those holdover reticles, like the Boone and Crockett, or like those horseshoe style, their measurements are only accurate at the maximum magnification setting if the reticle is in the second focal plane. So they have to be used at maximum magnification. Because of that, we started seeing scope companies move that reticle to the first focal plane. And what you see there is, as you zoom through the magnification range of the scope, the reticle will get smaller or larger. Smaller for the low magnifications, larger for the higher magnifications. And what that is doing is keeping those distance measurements. For the Boone and Crockett reticle, I memorized, if you zero for 200, the first mark is at 2.25 minutes of angle. The next one is at 4.75 minutes of angle, roughly. If it's in the first focal plane, no matter where your magnification setting is, those values are accurate. So let's say you've got a 4 to 25 power scope for hunting. You get into a situation where I can't use this sucker at 25 power because it's all mirage. I've got to dial it down to maybe 15 power. I want my reticle in the first focal plane if I'm using a holdover reticle, so that the values are still accurate. They are as accurate at 15 power as they are at 25. That's where the first focal plane becomes important. But so many of those scopes now have the bullet drop compensator, the knob where you dial your actual distance. So with that, the magnification setting doesn't matter. The thing that doesn't make sense to me is putting the reticle, a holdover reticle, in a first focal plane for a low power scope that is maybe a 1 to 6. When you dial that down to 1 power, that reticle gets so small. That's why they put the horseshoe around it, to give more reticle in your image to be able to aim with. So the values in there down to 500 or 600 yards, they're still accurate at a 1 power setting. It's just that you can't really see the image fine enough at 600 yards to use that tiny little first focal plane reticle. But the cool thing to have nowadays is a great big scope with high magnification, first focal plane setting. Cool doesn't necessarily get it done. The more complicated a scope is, the more complicated it is to learn, more complicated to master. So, here's my thoughts. I'm thinking primarily hunting. Big game hunting out west, where I may legitimately shoot to 400 or 500 yards. You're going to have to be a pretty damn good shot reliably to shoot beyond that. 10 power, 12 power, upper magnification, I think is more than adequate. I think a second focal plane reticle is okay, because I'm always going to choose, as I said, Leupold calls theirs a CDS, custom dial system. It's a bullet drop compensator. Okay, now I've switched to a different load in this 280 that I'm going to take for deer and antelope from now on. I haven't standardized it, so you can see I've just got tape on the thing here. So I've made a handmade CDS dial until I am absolutely certain that I've got the load where I want it, and then I will send in to Leupold and have them laser cut one for me. So with this new load, I'm 0 to 200, but if I've got a wolf at Wyoming at 500 yards and the conditions are good, I just push in my lock button, I dial it up to 5, and I'm going to be on. So the second focal plane reticle will work just fine for me. First focal plane reticles in scopes generally add a pretty fair amount to the price. They're more complicated to build. So that's my idea. Something like a 2 to 12 will do everything you need. A 3 to 9 will do probably everything you need. Do you need the custom parallax focus on the side? No. If it's like this and it's actually pretty difficult to move, so it's not going to get bumped around inadvertently, then it doesn't hurt anything. That's okay. Illuminated reticle, I like those. That adds several minutes at the beginning of the morning and the end of the evening for you to be able to get that reticle on your target and make a good hit. Okay, tubes, 1 will do, 30 is better. I'm not sure you need to go to 34 or 38, and as I said, the more you go to all these things, the more money you're going to spend. And that's the last thing I will say about these kind of optics. You get what you pay for. Leupold has everything from their budget priced, I believe they call it a VX Freedom now, all the way up to VX6 or into the Mark series, which are the more military type scopes. You can spend as much as you want to spend, but you can also get a pretty affordable scope in the VX Freedom that will do what most of us need to do. Vortex, very wide range of scopes. Burris, they have low end, they have high end. The European stuff, most of them are pretty high end stuff. They may make the lower price scopes, but they don't bother to import them here. But the point is, the more you spend on a scope, the better optics you're going to have. The brighter it's going to be at those low light conditions, the more rugged it is likely to be, and the more likely it is to be a one-time investment. So you get what you pay for. In terms of mounts, there are fixed mounts. In both of these rifles, if I had it to do over, if I was setting them up now, I would be using Picatinny rails. The thing I like about those is once I've got a Picatinny rail locked down, I put the rings where I need them for a given scope. If I use a quick detached scope, throw the levers, pull that scope off, I'm going to put it right back on and retain 0 if it's a quality mount. I can take a spare scope with me already set up, already zeroed and ready to go. I remember watching a sheep hunt video of Jim Shockey over in, I believe it was in Russia. He had a Leupold VX6 scope. He had taken a tumble down the mountain and the CDS dial had been wiped off of the rifle. The core adjustment knob was sticking up through. There were scars on the scope. It had been banged up badly. And he missed a shot, which he should have verified. He probably still had the ability to adjust that scope at least to a fixed point of 0. But with a good Picatinny rail mounting base and some quick detachable mounts, if I'm going on a hunt like that and there's a whole lot of money involved, I don't think it's unreasonable to take 2 scopes. I've got a second scope that I can pop right back on there with its own quick detach mounts. It's already pre-zeroed and I'm still in the hunt. So if I were doing it over and if I were to go on a really expensive foreign hunts, which is very unlikely at this point in my life, that's how I would set one up. You get what you pay for, learn how to use these things, and you can do some incredibly precise shooting at distances that we used to think were a fluke. So hopefully this has been useful to you. If you like my videos, I ask you to subscribe or resubscribe as necessary. Give me a thumbs up. Send it around to your friends. Part of the thrill of going hunting is getting ready for the hunt. It's almost more fun than the hunt itself sometimes. So think through what you want to do. Live that dream. If you've always wanted to go to Wyoming or Colorado and hunt elk, then save up and do it while you can, because I'm running into health problems that are going to limit what I can do. Don't do what I did. I lived out there and I did it as much as I could when I lived there, but I had about a 20 or 30 year gap there where I didn't live there and didn't spend the money I needed to try to go do those sort of things, and I regret it now. Don't regret it. Go do what you want to do. Be safe out there, folks. Thank you for watching.
Okay, we got them both here now. You ready? Bud got one. Ginger got one. Uh-huh. Oh, she missed it. She usually gets them, doesn't she, bud? Okay, girl, last one. You ready? You ready? Yeah. That's all there is till next time.